Under the flickering neon of a 1960s Manhattan skyline, a new kind of American hero was being forged. Joe Namath was not just a quarterback. He was a cultural earthquake. When he took the snap for the New York Jets, he wasn't just playing a game. He was leading a revolution of the AFL against the established, iron-fisted NFL. On January 12, 1969, in the humidity of Miami's Orange Bowl, he did the unthinkable. He didn't just win Super Bowl III, he guaranteed it. In that moment, Broadway Joe became immortal. But immortality in the NFL is bought with a heavy price. For every legendary touchdown pass and every late-night headline, there was a target on his back. Behind the swagger and the charismatic smile lay a body held together by surgical tape and sheer willpower. Namath's career was a gauntlet of pain, played out in an era where the rules didn't protect the quarterback. They targeted him. To the fans who lived through watching the highlights of Namath's knees buckling on the green concrete of Giant Stadium, the story is familiar, but the deeper truth lies in the men who made those years a living hell. Legends like Namath are defined by their triumphs, but they are hardened by their enemies. His journey was paved with rivalries that went far beyond the scoreboard. There were men who wanted to break his spirit, men who succeeded in breaking his body, and men in suits who tried to extinguish his fire in the name of decorum. Now, at 82 years old, the man who once captivated the world looks back at the wreckage of those years. The knees still ache from the turf of long-gone stadiums like Shea and the Orange Bowl, and the memories of the hits still resonate like a ringing in the ears after a blindside sack. Today, we look at the men who stood across from the legend, not with a handshake, but with a grudge. This is the story of Joe Namath and the 6 men who defined the darker side of his legendary career. These are the figures he couldn't forget, and in many ways, couldn't forgive. Number 6, Pete Rozelle. When we talk about the Shield and the corporate juggernaut that is the modern NFL, we are talking about the house that Pete Rozelle built. As the commissioner of the NFL during its most transformative era, Rozelle was the ultimate guardian of the league's image. He wanted the NFL to be seen as a clean-cut, family-oriented institution. And then there was Joe Namath. The tension between Rozelle and Namath was a clash of 2 different Americas. Rozelle represented the 1950s establishment, order, discipline, and the authority of the front office. Namath represented the 1960s counterculture, individuality, rebellion, and a refusal to be owned. The hatred peaked in 1969, just months after Namath had delivered the greatest upset in sports history. Namath owned a popular Manhattan bar called Bachelor's 3. It was the epicenter of the New York social scene, a place where celebrities, athletes, and, according to the FBI and Rozelle, undesirables congregated. Rozelle, citing the league's gambling policy, issued an ultimatum: sell your interest in the bar or be suspended from the NFL. For Namath, this wasn't about a nightclub. It was about the principle of a man's right to his own life outside the lines. In a tearful televised press conference in June 1969, Namath actually announced his retirement from football at the age of 26, rather than bow to Rozelle's demands. Though he eventually returned after selling the bar, the resentment never truly left him. To Namath, Rozelle was the man who tried to put a leash on a legend. He saw the commissioner not as a leader, but as a tyrant who prioritized image over the soul of the players. The Bachelor's 3 incident remained a scar on Namath's legacy, a reminder that no matter how many games you win, the man in the suit always thinks he owns you. Even years later, Namath would recount how Rozelle's investigators would follow him, trying to catch him in a moment of weakness. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was psychological warfare against the man who had just saved the merger by winning Super Bowl III. To Joe, it was the ultimate betrayal by the league he had just put on the map. Number 5, Don Shula. To the world, Don Shula is the winningest coach in NFL history, the architect of the only perfect season with the 1972 Miami Dolphins. But to Joe Namath, Shula was the face of the enemy, the man who stood on the opposite sideline during the most pivotal game of his life, Super Bowl III. In 1969, Shula's Baltimore Colts were 18-point favorites. They were the unbeatable team, representing the superior NFL. When Namath made his famous guarantee, Shula viewed it as an act of ultimate disrespect. Shula was a man of preparation and rigid structure. Namath was a man of instinct and flair. The Jets' 16-7 victory that day didn't just win a trophy, it humiliated Shula. It was a loss that Shula carried with him for years, and when he moved to the Miami Dolphins in 1970, he became the primary obstacle in Namath's path within the AFC East. Throughout the early 70s, the Dolphins and the Jets engaged in a brutal divisional rivalry. While Namath was trying to keep the Jets relevant with failing knees, Shula was building a machine designed to crush him. Every time the Jets faced Miami, it felt personal. Shula's defenses didn't just want to stop Namath, they wanted to prove that the guarantee was a fluke of history. For Joe, Shula represented the cold, calculating efficiency of a league that was moving away from the gunslinger era and toward a more robotic style of play. They were two greats who could never see eye to eye because one lived for the moment and the other lived for the system. In the 1972 season, when the Dolphins went 17-0, Namath was one of the few who dared to challenge them, throwing for 403 yards against them in a losing effort. Shula's victory that year felt like a direct rebuttal to Namath's 1969 triumph. And the mutual coldness between the two remained a fixture of the AFC East for a decade. Number 4. Ben Davidson. If you want to understand the violence of the American Football League in the late 60s, you look at Ben Davidson, standing 6'8", with a handlebar mustache that looked like it belonged on a Wild West villain. The Oakland Raiders' defensive end was the most feared man on the field. In 1967, the Raiders and the Jets were the two powerhouses of the AFL. On a cold December day, the rivalry turned ugly. In a play that Jets fans still talk about with vitriol, Davidson came off the edge and delivered a hit to Namath that was so late and so high that it seemed designed for one purpose: to end a career. The hit broke Namath's jaw. In the aftermath, Namath didn't cry to the officials. He finished the game, his jaw wired, proving his toughness to a league that thought he was just a pretty boy. But the animosity toward Davidson remained. To Joe, Davidson wasn't just a tough player. He was a cheap shot artist. He represented a style of football that disregarded the safety of the players in favor of intimidation and brutality. When they met again in the legendary 1968 Heidi game and the subsequent 1968 AFL Championship, the air was thick with genuine hatred. Namath knew that every time he dropped back against the Raiders, Davidson was looking for a way to put him in the hospital. That kind of fear doesn't just go away. It turns into a deep-seated resentment for a man who chose to play outside the bounds of sportsmanship. For Namath, Davidson was the embodiment of the Raider mystique that he found both repulsive and dangerous. Number 3. The Soul Patrol, specifically Jack Tatum. By the early 1970s, the NFL had merged, and the violence had only intensified. No team embodied this more than the Oakland Raiders secondary, known as the Soul Patrol. Leading the charge was Jack Tatum, nicknamed the Assassin. Tatum's philosophy was simple. He didn't just want to break up a pass, he wanted to knock the receiver out of the game. For a quarterback like Namath, whose game relied on timing and the courage of his receivers like Don Maynard and George Sauer, Tatum was a nightmare. In their matchups throughout the 70s, Tatum and his cohorts targeted the very thing that made Namath great: his willingness to stand in the pocket and take a hit. Namath watched as Tatum delivered hits that would be banned in today's game, hits that left players paralyzed or with permanent brain damage. Joe's hatred for this style of play was rooted in a deep respect for his teammates. He saw Tatum not as a great defender, but as a man who played with a bloodlust that didn't belong in the sport. When the Raiders defeated the Jets in high-stakes games during the early 70s, it wasn't just a loss on the scoreboard, it was a physical assault. To Namath, Tatum represented the dark side of the game's evolution, a shift toward a mean-spirited football that he felt tarnished the beauty of the AFL's original explosive offense. He couldn't respect a man who saw injury as a badge of honor. Number 2. Bubba Smith. If there is one name that serves as the what if in the Joe Namath story, it is Bubba Smith. In the 1971 preseason, the Jets were playing the Baltimore Colts in an exhibition game that should have meant nothing. The date was August 7, 1971, and the venue was Tampa Stadium. But in the NFL of the 70s, there was no such thing as a meaningless game. Bubba Smith, the 6'7" defensive end, broke through the line and crashed into Namath's legs. It wasn't a dirty hit in the way Davidson's was, but the result was catastrophic. Namath's knee, already fragile from previous injuries, was shredded. He suffered a torn ACL and MCL. In 1971, that wasn't just a season-ending injury, it was a career-altering one. Before that hit, Namath still had the mobility to escape the pocket. After that hit, he was a statue. He spent the rest of his career playing on what he described as 2 sticks of kindling. The psychological impact of that hit by Bubba Smith was profound. It robbed the world of the Broadway Joe who could dance around defenders. Namath's resentment toward the circumstances of that injury and the man who delivered it simmered for decades. He felt that the veterans of the era, like Smith, should have known better than to go full tilt in a preseason game against a quarterback with a history of knee issues. It was the moment the magic of the 60s officially died. Every limp Namath has taken in his 70s and 80s can be traced back to that afternoon in 1971. Bubba Smith became the symbol of Joe's lost potential, the man who effectively ended the superstar phase of Namath's career and began the survival phase. For fans who watched him struggle through the 1974 season, where he managed to win the Comeback Player of the Year award, they saw a man playing through a level of agony that few could imagine. That pain had a name, and to Joe, that name was Bubba Smith. Number 1. The 1970s Pittsburgh Steelers, the Steel Curtain. Among the individuals Joe Namath faced, there was a collective force he grew to loathe out of pure frustration: the Steel Curtain. In the mid-70s, as Namath was entering the twilight of his career, the Pittsburgh Steelers became the gold standard of the NFL. Led by Joe Green, Jack Lambert, and L.C. Greenwood, they were a wall of iron that seemed specifically designed to punish aging quarterbacks. Namath's encounters with the Steelers were rarely pretty. By 1975 and 1976, the Jets were no longer the powerhouse of the late 60s, and facing Pittsburgh felt like a death sentence. Namath hated the way they dominated, not with finesse, but with a relentless, suffocating pressure. He often spoke of L.C. Greenwood, the man in the gold shoes, who seemed to be in his face on every single dropback. To Namath, the Steelers represented the era he could no longer keep up with. They were faster, stronger, and more specialized. While he was trying to play the game he learned under Bear Bryant at Alabama in the early 60s, the Steelers were playing 21st century football 30 years early. The frustration of being unable to move his legs while Joe Green bore down on him created a deep bitterness. It wasn't hatred born of a cheap shot, but hatred born of the realization that his time had passed, and the Steelers were the ones holding the door open for him to leave. As we look at Joe Namath today, at the age of 82, we see a man who has found a measure of peace. He's a father, a grandfather, and a survivor. He has lived through the alcoholism that once threatened to drown his legacy, and he has come out the other side with a clarity that only age can provide. But for a man like Joe, you don't just forget the men who stood in your way. You don't forget the broken jaws, the shredded ligaments, or the commissioners who tried to take away your livelihood. These figures, Rozelle, Shula, Davidson, Tatum, and Smith, were the whetstones that sharpened the legend of Broadway Joe. Without Pete Rozelle's opposition, Namath wouldn't have become a symbol of freedom. Without Ben Davidson's brutality, he wouldn't have proven his legendary toughness. Without Don Shula, he wouldn't have had a giant to slay in 1969. The fans remember Namath not just for the yards he threw, but for the way he carried himself against these adversaries. They remember the 1972 shootout with Johnny Unitas, a game where Namath threw for 496 yards and 6 touchdowns as a defiance of the physical pain these enemies had inflicted upon him. They remember the 1985 Hall of Fame induction, where the white shoes were replaced by a suit, but the fire in his eyes remained. Joe Namath's story is a tapestry of 1960s glamour and 1970s grit. It's the story of a man who changed the game's economics, its style, and its place in American culture. But more than that, it's a story of a man who refused to be broken, even when the world sent its most formidable villains to do the job. When Joe Namath walked off the field for the last time as a Los Angeles Ram in 1977, his body was failing, but his spirit was intact. He had outlasted many of his rivals, and he had done it on his own terms. At 82, he doesn't need to shout his guarantees anymore. The history books have already done that for him. The grudges may remain, tucked away in the corners of a mind that still remembers every snap at Shea Stadium, every drop of liniment, and every surgery, but they are a testament to a life fully lived. To be hated or to hate in the NFL of that era was a sign of relevance. It meant you mattered, it meant you were a threat, and Joe Namath was the greatest threat the old guard ever faced. Legends are not just built on the friends they make, but on the enemies they refuse to let win. Stay tuned and subscribe to get to know more about NFL insights.